My name is Clara Jensen, and I'm 61 years old. My father disowned me the night I told him I loved a woman. He said I'd brought shame to his name and slammed the door on me forever. But years later, when he lost everything and had nowhere to go, he ended up sleeping in the very house I secretly saved from his debt without ever knowing whose hands had rescued him. Until the day he found out, and it destroyed him. I was born and raised in a small Vermont town where the winters were long, the neighbors knew every secret, and my father's name carried a kind of quiet power. He owned a woodworking business that had been in our family for generations. Everyone admired his craftsmanship, his furniture pieces were built to outlast people. I used to think he built himself that way too strong, unbreakable, untouchable. Growing up, he was a man who believed in order and reputation more than affection. His love was measured in lessons, not hugs. Do what's right, not what's easy, he'd say, his voice steady as a hammer on wood. When I was a child, I mistook that firmness for wisdom. It wasn't until much later that I realized it came from fear of what others might say, fear of not being enough. My mother softened his edges. She had a way of seeing light where there was shadow. When she passed away suddenly in my 20s, something in him hardened beyond repair. The laughter that used to fill our home vanished like sawdust swept off the floor. I tried to live by his rules. For years, I molded myself into the daughter I thought he wanted, a woman who kept her emotions quiet and her ambitions smaller than his comfort allowed. I worked odd jobs, saved every dollar, and when I finally decided to go to college in my 30s, I could still hear his voice in my head warning me about people who waste time chasing change. But I went anyway. I graduated later than most, started a little business restoring old furniture, and bought a modest cottage tucked between birch trees. It wasn't much, but it was mine, every nail, every brush of paint. My father visited once after I moved in. He walked through the rooms like a man inspecting an investment, not a home. He complimented the structure, criticized the paint, and left me with a half-hearted pat on the shoulder. That was his way of saying he was proud. Still, I clung to every word of approval like it was sunlight in winter. For all his coldness, I loved him. I thought maybe, someday, he'd see me not as a reflection of his expectations, but as a person. Then I met Alyssa Monroe. She owned a small antique shop on the edge of town, the kind of place that smelled of cedar and forgotten stories. She was younger than me by a few years, but her spirit felt older, steady, calm, filled with a kind of warmth that drew people in. We met when she bought an old chair I had restored. She came back the next week for a table, then the week after that just to bring me coffee. Before long, our conversations stretched from daylight into dusk, and without realizing it, I began to laugh again. The kind of laugh that comes from the soul, the kind I hadn't known since my mother died. When I told my father about Alyssa, I expected awkwardness, maybe confusion. But what I got instead was something colder, something final. He looked at me as if I had confessed to a crime. His jaw tightened, his eyes filled with disgust that cut deeper than any word could. He said I had ruined the family name. He said my mother would be ashamed if she were alive. I wanted to tell him that Alyssa was kind, that she made me feel seen, that she reminded me of the compassion he once had, but my voice broke before I could. He didn't shout, that would have been easier. Instead, he spoke with that chilling calm he reserved for strangers. He told me not to come back to his house, that he couldn't stand to look at me. The air between us turned heavy, like the moment before a storm breaks. I remember standing in his doorway, the porch light flickering, illuminating the tears I refused to let fall. Behind him, I saw the same front door we had painted together when I was 7, our hands both stained white with primer. He had smiled at me then, told me that someday this house would be mine. Now, that same door closed slowly in my face. The click of the latch echoed louder than any scream. I stood there for what felt like hours, the smell of pine and varnish mixing with the metallic taste of betrayal. I wanted to knock, to plead, to make him remember the little girl who used to sit in his workshop handing him nails just to be near him, but I didn't. I turned around, walked down the porch steps, and into a night that suddenly felt too big for me. Driving home that night, the roads blurred through my tears. The town I'd grown up in, the place that once felt safe, now felt like a cage of memories I didn't belong to anymore. I passed by the old diner where we used to eat pancakes on Sundays, The park where he taught me to ride a bike. The church where my mother's funeral was held. Every place held a piece of us, and each one stung like an open wound. When I got home, Alyssa was waiting for me on the porch, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She didn't ask what happened. She just looked at me and knew. I fell into her arms, and for the first time, I allowed myself to cry without shame. She whispered that I still had a family, that blood didn't define love. I wanted to believe her. But deep down, I couldn't help but feel that a part of me had been erased, the part that once believed a father's love was unconditional. The next morning, I woke to a silence I hadn't known before. It wasn't peaceful. It was the silence of absence. The silence that follows after someone decides you no longer exist in their world. I tried to distract myself with work, sanding old oak cabinets and polishing vintage mirrors, but every reflection I saw reminded me of the distance between who I was and who he wanted me to be. Days turned into months. Birthdays passed without calls. Holidays came and went like strangers. I sent him a few letters, though I never knew if he read them. I told him about my business, about Alyssa, about how I hoped one day we could talk again. I told myself I was fine without him, that I didn't need his approval, but even lies can sound comforting when you repeat them long enough. Still, life moved forward. Alyssa and I built something gentle and real, a small world that felt safe, even as the memory of my father lingered in every quiet moment. I thought I had accepted the loss, that I'd buried that pain deep enough to live with it. But the truth was, some wounds never really close, they just wait. I believed the door between us had closed forever that night, but fate has a way of reopening what pride tries to seal. I had no idea that years later, I would stand on another porch, facing the same man who had once turned me away, and this time, I would be the one deciding whether he had a home to return to. Just when I believed my life had fallen apart, Alyssa became the reason I started to live again. After my father disowned me, I felt like a tree stripped bare in winter, alive but hollow, waiting for a season that might never come. I had lost not just a parent but the foundation of who I thought I was. I spent weeks going through motions, pretending to be fine, fixing furniture, and smiling for customers, but the emptiness followed me everywhere. And then there was Alyssa. She didn't fill the silence with pity or promises. She simply existed beside me, with a kind of patience that made the quiet feel less cruel. Alyssa was nothing like my father. Where he demanded, she invited. Where he judged, she understood. Her world wasn't ruled by appearances or pride, but by stories. Each antique in her shop held a piece of someone's past, and she treated those fragments like treasure. I would spend hours helping her restore old clocks and cabinets, my hands tracing the same scratches left by strangers long gone. Maybe that's why I felt drawn to her. We were both restorers of wood, of time, and eventually, of each other. There was something poetic in the way we turned decay into beauty, as if we were rebuilding pieces of our own hearts along the way. Moving in with her wasn't something I planned. It happened slowly, naturally, like two rivers meeting. One evening, I stayed over after helping her move inventory. One night became two, and two became a month. She never asked me to stay, but she never had to. Her home felt like safety, a cozy, cluttered cottage filled with mismatched chairs and the scent of lavender and old books. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest. And after years of living under judgment, honesty felt like luxury. Mornings in her house were different. They didn't begin with shame or silence. She would brew coffee before dawn, humming to herself, and I'd wake to the sound of her kettle whistling and birds outside the window. We'd sit together, sipping from chipped mugs, talking about everything and nothing. She asked about my childhood once, about my father's shop, and when I told her he'd disowned me, she didn't flinch. She just said, "Sometimes love breaks before it bends." Those words stuck with me. For the first time in years, I didn't feel defective. I felt seen. Alyssa encouraged me to dream bigger than I ever had. She believed in me in a way that felt almost foreign. When she looked at me, she didn't see a disappointment or a disgrace, she saw potential. She convinced me to expand my restoration business, saying people needed stories, not just furniture. Together, we turned my side hobby into something real, a small restoration studio that soon caught the attention of antique dealers across the state. The first time I saw my name printed, on a business card, I cried. Alyssa hugged me and whispered, "You built this, Clara." You built yourself back. Those early years with her were some of the happiest of my life. There was a rhythm to our days. Work, laughter, shared dinners under soft light. We were partners in every sense. Still, even amid joy, there were nights when my past echoed through me like an unfinished song. I missed my father in ways that confused me. Sometimes, while sanding a chair leg or polishing a tabletop, I'd catch the faint scent of sawdust and feel his presence hovering at the edge of memory. I missed the sound of his workshop radio playing old jazz as he worked. I missed the steadiness in his hands, the rare softness in his eyes when he was proud of me. I told Alyssa once that I wished I could stop missing him, that it felt wrong to long for someone who had thrown me away. She smiled sadly and said, "Missing someone isn't weakness, Clara. It's proof that your heart's still working." That comforted me for a while, but the ache never truly left. It became a quiet companion, always there, sitting beside the happiness I'd found. Every few months, I sent my father a letter. I never mentioned Alyssa by name, only that I was doing well, that I hoped he was too. I wrote about my studio, about how business was growing, about the new house projects we'd finished. I didn't beg for forgiveness or ask to be accepted again. I just wanted him to know I was still out there, still trying to be the daughter he once loved. None of those letters were ever answered, not once. The mailbox remained empty, and each silence cut deeper than the last. Still, I kept writing. Part of me believed that if I kept reaching out, someday he'd reach back. 3 years passed in that strange balance between fulfillment and longing. Alyssa and I built a life that felt strong and steady, yet my father's shadow lingered in the background of every milestone. When we expanded our workshop and B. Pelbliss signed our first big contract, I wanted to call him. When Alyssa and I bought our first truck for deliveries, I imagined how he would have admired the craftsmanship. But the phone stayed silent. His silence was his final weapon, and even from a distance, it could still wound me. One quiet autumn afternoon, I was working in the studio when the phone rang. I almost didn't answer. It was a number I didn't recognize. The voice on the other end was deep, formal, unfamiliar. "Is this Miss Clara Jensen?" he asked. I said yes, cautious. He introduced himself as Eric Blaine, an attorney from my hometown. The moment he said my father's name, my heart stopped. For a fleeting second, I thought maybe my father was reaching out through him, maybe he was ready to reconcile. But that hope faded as Eric continued. He said my father was in serious financial trouble, that his woodworking shop had gone bankrupt, and that his house, our family home, was on the verge of foreclosure. I remember gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles went white. My first instinct wasn't anger, it was panic. For all the pain he'd caused me, he was still my father. The thought of him losing the house where I grew up, the house where my mother's laughter once echoed, felt unbearable. I thanked the man for calling, promised I'd think about what could be done, and hung up. When I turned around, Alyssa was standing in the doorway, her face pale with concern. "Who was that?" she asked softly. I told her everything. She didn't interrupt. When I finished, she took my hand and said, "Do what will let you sleep at night, Clara." Her voice trembled slightly, but there was no judgment in it, only understanding. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, hearing my father's voice in my head, the same voice that once told me I was no longer his daughter. The irony stung. He had disowned me to protect his pride, and now that same pride had left him broken. I didn't know what I would do, but I knew one thing for sure. No matter how deeply he had hurt me, I could never stop being his daughter. I didn't realize then that the choice I was about to make would change both our lives forever. When the lawyer told me my father was about to lose everything, I should have walked away, but love makes fools of the wounded. The moment Eric Blaine's voice faded from the receiver, I sat frozen in my studio, surrounded by unfinished furniture and the scent of varnish. Outside, the late afternoon light filtered through the windows, painting everything gold and quiet. But inside me, a storm had already begun. My father, the man who had built his identity from pride and precision, was falling apart, and the world hadn't bothered to warn me until now. I tried to process what I'd heard, but the details blurred together in my mind: bankruptcy, foreclosure, unpaid debts. I could almost see him sitting in his empty workshop, the machine silent, the air thick with dust and regret. The image tore at me in ways I didn't expect. For years, I had imagined what I would say if I ever saw him again. I had rehearsed words of anger, speeches about pain and rejection, but not once had I pictured him as a man broken and desperate. I thought of the way his hands used to steady mine when I was a child learning how to hold a hammer, how he'd say, "Control comes from trust, not force." I wondered when he had forgotten his own lesson. That night, Alyssa and I sat in the kitchen long after dinner had gone cold. The room smelled faintly of lemon oil and coffee, the way it always did after a long workday. She didn't try to convince me either way. She just listened as I went over every possibility, every reason why I should or shouldn't get involved. I said things like, "He wouldn't do the same for me, and he made his choice," but none of it felt true. Finally, Alyssa reached across the table, took my hand, and said softly, "Do what will let, and you sleep at night." Those words lingered in my mind long after she went to bed. I stayed up for hours, sitting by the window, staring at the moonlight spilling across old family photos. There was one picture of my father and me in his shop. I was 8 years old, grinning with missing teeth, holding a chisel that was twice the size of my hand. He stood behind me, proud and tall, one arm draped protectively around my shoulders. Looking at that photo, I felt both love and grief. The man in that picture was gone, but he had once existed. Maybe that was reason enough. By morning, my decision was made. It wasn't logical. It wasn't even fair. But it was mine. I called Eric Blaine back and asked him for every detail about the debt. His tone softened when he realized who I was. He told me my father's business had collapsed under unpaid loans, that the bank was preparing to take the house within the month. The total amount was far more than I had imagined, a number so large it made my stomach twist. I didn't have that kind of money sitting around, but I had savings, investments, and a growing business. I could make it work, though it would leave me vulnerable. Alyssa didn't protest when I told her. She just nodded with quiet understanding, though I saw the worry in her eyes. "If this is what you need to do, then we'll find a way," she said. That "we" meant everything. She didn't owe my father anything, yet she stood beside me like it was her fight too. Together, we went over my accounts, called the bank, and arranged a meeting. Every step felt surreal, like I was stepping back into a life I had long tried to escape. The meeting was brief but heavy. The banker looked at me curiously when I said I wanted to purchase the mortgage under a different name, my company's name, Jensen Restorations. It was a calculated choice. I didn't want my father to know it was me. Pride was his first language, and I knew he'd rather lose everything than accept help from the daughter he had rejected. The paperwork took weeks, every form a reminder of how complicated love could become when tangled with pain. But in the end, the deal went through. The house, my childhood home, was safe. I thought I would feel relief. Instead, I felt hollow. It was strange. I had just saved the one thing that had shaped so much of who I was, yet I couldn't share it with the person who mattered most. He'd never know. That secrecy was the price I had to pay, and it stung more than I expected. I stood outside the bank that day, the cool wind biting at my face, and realized that forgiveness doesn't always come in words sometimes. It's hidden in quiet actions no one ever sees. Weeks passed. The world went on as if nothing had changed. I returned to work, restoring antique pieces and running my studio. Business grew. Customers came and went, and Alyssa filled our days with laughter and soft music, but part of me was always elsewhere, wondering if my father had noticed the foreclosure had stopped, if he had paused long enough to wonder why. I imagined him signing the new paperwork, unaware that my name was written between the lines of legal jargon, protecting him from the edge of ruin. One afternoon, Alyssa found me staring blankly at an unfinished dresser, lost in thought. She placed a hand on my shoulder and said, "You did the right thing." I nodded, but the words didn't land. The right thing didn't always feel right. It felt like cutting yourself open just to stop someone else from bleeding. I wanted to believe it would mean something, that someday he'd understand what I had done, that maybe it could mend what was broken between us. But deep down, I knew that wasn't why I had done it. I hadn't saved his house to win him back. I had done it because love, no matter how bruised, doesn't vanish. It lingers, stubborn and loyal, even when pride tells it not to. Months went by, and life settled into a rhythm again. I stopped checking the mail for letters that never came. I stopped expecting anything in return. My father remained silent, and I accepted that as his answer. Saving his home hadn't changed the past, it hadn't erased the words he'd said or the pain they left behind. But I could sleep at night, and maybe that was enough. I remember one evening, sitting on the porch with Alyssa as the sun dipped below the trees. She asked me if I regretted it. I thought for a long time before answering. No, I said quietly. I just wish he knew it wasn't charity, it was love. She smiled sadly, resting her head on my shoulder. Some people aren't ready to see love that way, she said. I didn't respond, because I knew she was right. Years later, when I least expected it, that act of mercy, that silent forgiveness would come back to me in ways I couldn't have imagined. I thought saving his house would close a chapter, but it only opened another one that would test every boundary of my heart. What I didn't realize was that saving his home would one day bring him right back to mine, and nothing about that reunion would feel like forgiveness. It had been 5 years since I'd last seen my father, and yet there he was, standing in my driveway, older, thinner, and utterly broken. I remember that night vividly. The air was sharp with winter's bite, and the world outside my window was drenched in that gray stillness that comes just before snow. Alyssa and I were sitting by the fireplace, sharing a quiet dinner, when the sound of gravel crunching beneath tires interrupted the calm. Headlights swept across our front yard, casting long, eerie shadows against the walls. It was too late for visitors, and a chill ran through me that had nothing to do with the cold. Alyssa looked out the window first. I could see the way her expression changed. Soft curiosity folding into disbelief. Clara. Isn't that? Her voice trailed off, but she didn't need to finish. My body already knew before my mind caught up. There, stepping out of a rusted old pickup truck, was my father. The years had carved deep lines into his face, his hair now silver and thin, his posture bent under a weight I couldn't name. He carried a single duffel bag, worn at the edges, and when he turned toward the house, the headlights revealed eyes that looked both lost and exhausted. For a moment, I couldn't move. My heart thudded painfully against my ribs, torn between anger and something that felt dangerously like pity. 5 years of silence had lived between us, and now he was standing at my door as though no time had passed at all. Alyssa touched my arm gently. "Do you want me to?" she began, but I shook my head. Some things, I knew, couldn't be handled by anyone else. When I opened the door, the cold night air rushed in, biting at my skin. My father stood at the bottom of the steps, his eyes darting briefly toward me before looking away. "Clara," he said, his voice hoarse. I didn't know where else to go. For a second, I couldn't find my voice. There were 1,000 questions I wanted to ask, but all that came out was a quiet, "What happened?" He told me his business had finally closed for good. The shop, the one that had once been his pride, was gone. The bank had taken most of his tools, and he'd sold what little he had left to survive. He spoke in short, heavy sentences, as if the words themselves were too heavy to carry. I listened silently, my heart sinking deeper with every syllable. He said he had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. What he didn't know, what I couldn't tell him, was that years ago, when that same house he had lost was on the brink of foreclosure, it had been me who quietly saved it. He believed the bank had been merciful, as he called it. He didn't realize that mercy had my name on the deed. "I just need a place for a few days," he said softly, glancing up at me with something that looked almost like shame. "Until things settle." I felt Alyssa's gaze from behind me, cautious and uncertain. Her eyes asked the question I couldn't answer. Was I ready for this? Every instinct in me screamed to protect the life I had built, to guard it from the man who had once shattered me. And yet, another part, the part still shaped by a daughter's love, couldn't say no. So, I nodded. "Come inside." He stepped across the threshold slowly, his boots leaving faint trails of mud on the hardwood floor. Alyssa offered a polite, tentative smile but said little. She knew this was something fragile, something that could crumble under the wrong word. My father looked around the house with quiet curiosity, his eyes tracing the walls, the furniture, the small signs of the life Alyssa and I had made together. He didn't say anything, but I could tell from his expression that he noticed the details, the photographs, the 2 coffee mugs on the table, the extra pair of shoes by the door. Still, he said nothing, only nodded as if pretending not to understand what those things meant. I led him to the guest room at the back of the house. It was simple but warm, with a small bed and a quilt I had sewn last spring. He placed his bag down carefully, almost reverently, and murmured, "You've done well for yourself." The words might have been kind if they hadn't carried the weight of surprise, as though he hadn't expected me to survive without his approval. I forced a smile and told him to rest. That night, long after the lights went out, I lay awake listening to the faint creak of floorboards as he moved around the house. It felt strange having him here, under my roof, after all the years of distance. There was a tension that clung to the air, unspoken but heavy. Alyssa reached for my hand in the dark and whispered, "You don't have to carry him again." I squeezed his hand but said nothing. Part of me wanted to believe I could handle it, that letting him in was just an act of compassion. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. It was unfinished business wearing the mask of forgiveness. The next morning, the house felt different. The air was thicker, quieter. My father sat at the kitchen table, sipping coffee Alyssa had made. He looked uncomfortable, out of place, but also strangely determined to act normal. He asked about my business, my home, even about the repairs I'd done on the porch. I answered politely, but every word felt like walking on a tightrope, careful, measured, afraid of falling into old wounds. Alyssa stayed mostly silent, moving gracefully through the kitchen, her presence both calming and tense. Over the next few days, his presence began to settle into the rhythm of the house. He offered to help with small chores, fixing a cabinet hinge, sweeping the porch, trimming the hedges outside. At first, it seemed harmless, maybe even healing. But there were moments, fleeting and sharp, when I'd catch a glimpse of the man he used to be. The authority in his posture, the subtle disapproval in his glances, the way he avoided saying Alyssa's name. It was like living with a ghost of my own past, a reminder of the pain I thought I'd buried. Still, I told myself it was temporary. Just a few days, but a few days stretched into a week, and by the end of that week, I could feel the balance of my home shifting. His belongings began to spread beyond the guest room, a coat on the chair, tools on the counter, old habits reappearing in the corners of my life. The laughter that once filled the evenings grew quieter. I caught Alyssa looking at me sometimes with that silent question again. How long will this go on? I didn't have an answer. I wanted to believe I was doing the right thing, that compassion was stronger than resentment. But as the days went by, the walls of my house began to feel smaller, my own voice softer, my boundaries blurrier. Letting him in that night changed everything. I just didn't realize then that kindness, when offered without caution, can sometimes invite old ghosts to move in and make themselves at home. By the end of that week, my home no longer felt like mine, and my father's presence began to unravel the life I'd built. It's strange how a house can hold both love and resentment in its walls, whispering truths you try to ignore. For the first few weeks after my father moved in, I tried to convince myself that everything would settle. I told Alyssa, and maybe even myself, that time would soften the edges of the past, that maybe being under the same roof again would build some kind of fragile peace. But peace never came, only tension, stretched thin across every inch of the home I had built with so much care. At first, it was small things, the way my father looked around the living room as though he were inspecting a stranger's house, his eyes darting from the photographs of Alyssa and me to the delicate furniture I had restored by hand. He criticized quietly but consistently, like a carpenter tapping at flaws no one else could see. Too modern, he'd say of the chairs. Too cluttered, he'd remark about the bookshelves. Even the candles my favorite cedarwood scent drew complaints. "Smells too sweet," he muttered once, wrinkling his nose. It wasn't just about the house. It was about me, about everything I represented that no longer fit into his rigid view of the world. Alyssa tried. She really did. She greeted him each morning with kindness, offered him coffee, made polite conversation, but he barely acknowledged her. He spoke to her only when absolutely necessary, and even then it was curt, formal, as if she were a guest who had overstayed her welcome. When we sat down for dinner, he talked over her, ignoring her presence completely. He asked about my business, about the studio, about the restoration jobs I'd taken on, but never once did he mention Alyssa by name. It was as though she didn't exist in his version of my life. I could feel her withdrawing more each day, quietly retreating to her shop or taking long walks just to avoid the atmosphere of our home. It broke my heart to see her dim like that. She had been my light when everything else fell apart, but my father's presence cast long shadows. I knew she didn't blame me, but she was carrying the weight of my choice to let him stay. I began to wonder if I had invited him in not out of kindness but out of guilt, the same guilt that had haunted me for years. Whispering that maybe I hadn't done enough to earn forgiveness. Dinner became the hardest part of the day. My father spoke as if the past 10 years hadn't happened, as if I were still the obedient daughter who needed his approval. He questioned my decisions, the way I ran my business, even the colors I chose for the decee. Walls. "You always did like showing off," he said one night, gesturing to the framed newspaper article about my restoration studio that hung near the kitchen. His words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they came so easily like reflexes he'd never bothered to unlearn. I tried to reason with him, to find some sliver of gratitude or humility beneath the pride, but it was buried deep. Even as he depended on me for shelter and warmth, he carried himself like a man who still believed he was owed more. I began to realize that his pride was his armor, thin, brittle, but fiercely guarded. And I was the reminder of every crack in it. Alyssa began spending longer hours at her shop. When she came home, she would move quietly through the house, her voice gentle but distant. I knew she was avoiding conflict, and I couldn't blame her. Every conversation with my father felt like walking through a room full of glass, one wrong word and everything could shatter. One evening, as I passed by his room, I heard him muttering under his breath. His door was half open, and his voice carried just enough for me to catch the words, "This house should have been mine anyway." The sentence hit me like a cold wind. My first reaction was disbelief, then anger, and finally, a hollow ache. The house he spoke of, the one he believed the bank had spared, existed because I had saved it. I had poured my savings, my hard work, my forgiveness into keeping it from being taken away, and yet, in his mind, it was still his by right. That night, I sat alone in the living room, staring at the photographs on the wall. One of them showed the two of us in front of that very house decades ago, his arm around me, both of us smiling. I tried to remember what that moment had felt like, but it was gone, replaced by an emptiness I couldn't describe. I had wanted so desperately to heal what was broken between us, but it was becoming clear that he wasn't ready to let it heal. To him, I was still the child who needed his guidance, never the woman who had found her strength without him. The tension only grew. I found myself shrinking inside my own home, speaking softer, moving quieter, as if afraid to disturb the fragile peace. I began to feel invisible, like I was paying penance for being myself. The more I tried to make things work, the less I recognized the space around me. It was as if my father's presence had rearranged the very air in the house, replacing warmth with a heavy, lingering discomfort. Finally, one evening, after another strained dinner where silence filled the spaces between every word, I confronted him. I didn't plan it, the words simply spilled out. "Why are you here if you can't stand the life I've built?" I asked, my voice trembling. For a moment, he looked stunned, then something in him cracked. His shoulders slumped, and he sank into the chair across from me. "I have nothing left, Clara," he said quietly. "No business, no reputation, no pride. Let me keep my dignity." His voice broke on that last word, and for the first time, I saw not the proud man who had disowned me, but the hollow one left behind. His eyes shimmered with tears he refused to let fall, and for a fleeting moment, I almost pitied him. Almost. But then I thought of Alyssa, of the home we'd built, of the peace he'd disrupted, and the pity turned to exhaustion. What could dignity mean to a man who had thrown away his only child? I didn't have an answer, and maybe he didn't either. I simply stood there in silence, feeling the distance between us stretch wider than ever before. That night, I couldn't sleep. The walls of the house felt alive, echoing every unspoken word, every sigh, every memory of what once was. I wandered through the dark halls, unable to quiet the noise in my head. That's when I noticed his door slightly ajar, a faint glow from the bedside lamp spilling into the hallway. Inside, his duffel bag sat open at the foot of the bed, half unzipped. Something inside caught my eye, a bundle of old, weathered envelopes tied with a thin piece of string. My heart stopped when I realized what they were. Then one night, I discovered something in his old duffel bag that made my hands tremble. Inside that worn duffel bag were the letters I had sent him, every single one, unopened but kept. My heart pounded as I stared down at the bundle. The paper yellowed at the edges, tied neatly with a rubber band as though it were something precious. For years, I had imagined those letters lying forgotten or torn apart, maybe tossed into a drawer or burned in anger. But there they were, carefully preserved, as if part of him couldn't bear to let them go. The sight of them broke something inside me, not because he had kept them, but because he hadn't read a single word. They were symbols of everything we had lost. My forgiveness, his pride, and the years that had stretched between us, like a wound that never healed. My hands trembled as I lifted the bundle from his bag. The envelope still had my handwriting, the same looping cursive I had used on every birthday card and school project growing up. My name and address stood out clearly against the paper, each letter addressed to him in hope, each one returned in silence. I remembered writing them, the careful choice of words, the way I had folded each page with tears still drying on my cheeks. I had written about my life, about Alyssa, about the studio, about small things I thought might remind him of love. And now, to find them like this, unopened but cherished, was like finding an entire chapter of my life frozen in time. I sat on the floor beside the bed for a long while, holding the letters in my lap, unsure whether to feel grateful or furious. Part of me wanted to open them, to tear them all apart and read my own words back to myself, to remember the woman I had been when I wrote them. But another part of me couldn't. It felt like trespassing on a grave, on a silence he had chosen. So I wrapped them back in the band and carried them out to the porch, the cold night air biting at my skin. Alyssa was there, sitting with a blanket around her shoulders, waiting for me like she somehow knew I'd found something. When I told her what I had discovered, she didn't look surprised. She listened quietly, her expression soft and thoughtful. When I finished, she said only one thing. Maybe keeping them was his way of holding on. I turned the phrase over in my mind again and again. Holding on to what? To guilt? To memory? To the daughter he had disowned but couldn't forget? It was a comforting thought, but also a painful one. Because if he had been holding on, it meant that all these years of silence weren't absence, they were avoidance. He couldn't face me, couldn't face himself. That night, I sat on the porch long after Alyssa went inside. The air was heavy with the scent of pine and the faint hum of crickets in the distance. I looked out over the yard, the same patch of grass where my father had parked his truck when he first arrived, and I wept. Not the kind of tears that come from anger, but the kind that come when you finally understand how much time has been wasted. I cried for every year we had lost to pride, for every letter I had written in vain, for every version of myself that had waited for him to come back. By morning, I was exhausted but calmer. I made coffee and sat by the kitchen window, watching the early light creep through the trees. A few minutes later, I heard him moving around the creak of floorboards, the soft clatter of a mug. When he entered the kitchen, he looked the same as always. Tired, composed, pretending everything was fine. I wondered how long he had been pretending like that, maybe his entire life. He offered a brief nod and poured himself a cup of coffee, the same way he used to every morning in his old workshop. I studied him in silence, wondering if I should bring up what I had found. Finally, I couldn't hold it in any longer. I found something, I said quietly. He looked up, confused, and then I saw the realization flicker across his face. His eyes dropped to the floor, his hands tightening around the mug. Your letters, I added softly. You kept them. He didn't speak for a long time. The ticking of the wall clock filled the room, loud and merciless. When he finally looked up, there was a mix of shame and sorrow in his eyes. Because I didn't know how to forgive you, he said at last, his voice trembling, without hating myself. The words hung in the air, fragile and heavy. I felt a sharp ache in my chest, the kind that comes when truth hits harder than expected. In that moment, I saw the man I once loved, not the proud craftsman, not the stern father, but the broken, human version of him who had spent years drowning in his own guilt. His confession didn't erase the past, but it softened something inside me. For the first time in decades, I saw regret in his eyes, and it wasn't for show. We sat in silence for what felt like forever. There were no apologies, no promises to change, just an unspoken understanding that we had both suffered enough. The letters lay between us on the table, small and simple, yet carrying more weight than any conversation we could have had. I wanted to tell him I forgave him, but the words wouldn't come. Forgiveness wasn't something I could give instantly, it was something that had to unfold slowly, like morning light after a long night. Later that afternoon, as he rested in the living room, I went back to the studio. The smell of varnish and wood polish greeted me, familiar and grounding. I ran my fingers along the edge of a half-finished cabinet, thinking about the years I had spent building things to last, even when people didn't. That's when it struck me I had been trying to rebuild him too, piece by piece, without realizing that some things couldn't be restored. That evening, we had dinner together, just the two of us. Alyssa was working late, and the house was unusually quiet. He spoke gently for once, asking about my projects, about the kinds of furniture I restored. I told him about the studio's success, how customers came from all over the state. He listened, and for the first time, I saw pride small, hesitant, but real flicker in his eyes. It was enough to remind me of who we used to be. As we cleared the dishes, I made a decision that had been weighing on me since the day he arrived. I couldn't keep carrying the truth about his house any longer. It had lived between us like a secret too heavy to bear. If there was ever a time for honesty, it was now. After dinner, I asked him to sit with me in the living room. The fire crackled softly, casting shadows on the walls. My heart raced as I began to speak. "There's something you need to know," I said quietly. He looked at me, puzzled, and I continued. "The house you live in, the one you thought the bank spared, it wasn't luck, and it wasn't mercy. I bought it back, Dad. I saved it." For a moment, he didn't move. His expression froze, his breath catching in his throat. Then his eyes widened, the shock slowly morphing into something darker, disbelief, anger, shame. The silence between us stretched unbearably long before he whispered, "You what?" But the truth, once spoken, didn't heal him, it shattered him. Sometimes redemption feels like betrayal when pride still sits at the table. The moment the truth left my lips, I felt the air shift around us, heavy, sharp, and unsteady. My father sat across from me in the dim glow of the fire, the same man who once told me I wasn't his daughter, now staring at me as though he didn't recognize me at all. His eyes flicked from my face to the floor, searching for logic, for denial, for any explanation that would make this not true. But I didn't waver. I repeated it slowly, deliberately, as if saying it aloud would finally set me free. "I was the one who saved the house, Dad. The mortgage, the debts, all of it. I did it through my company." For a long moment, he didn't respond. His hands, trembling slightly, gripped the arms of his chair. "You're lying," he whispered, his voice almost brittle. I reached into the drawer beside me and pulled out the folder I had prepared weeks ago, the one I'd told myself I'd never show him. I placed it on the coffee table and opened it, revealing the documents with my company's name printed clearly on every page. He leaned forward, scanning them slowly, the color draining from his face. The silence between us grew unbearable. When he finally spoke, his voice was so low I almost didn't hear it. "You humiliated me without even trying." I felt those words cut through me like a blade dulled by time, not sharp enough to wound deeply, but heavy enough to bruise. "That's not what I wanted," I said quietly. But he wasn't listening. His pride was bleeding, not his heart. He stood up abruptly, pacing across the room, muttering under his breath, "You saved me? My own daughter? After what I did to you?" He stopped, turning toward me, his eyes filled with something between anger and shame. "Do you know what it feels like to have your failures handed back to you like charity?" I wanted to tell him it wasn't charity, that it was love, that I had done it because, no matter how much pain he caused me, I couldn't watch him lose everything. But I knew words like that wouldn't reach him. His entire life had been built on control, on being the provider, the teacher, the authority. Now, for the first time, the balance had shifted, and it terrified him. He didn't speak to me for days after that. The house grew quiet again, but it wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet. It was thick, suffocating, the kind that makes you feel like every word might break something fragile. I went about my days trying to pretend it didn't hurt, restoring furniture in my studio, keeping myself busy with orders, sanding wood until my fingers ached. But every creak of the floorboards reminded me that he was still there, lingering like a storm that hadn't yet decided if it would pass. Alyssa noticed the shift immediately. She tried to comfort me in the small ways she always did: fresh coffee in the morning, gentle touches on my shoulder as she passed. One night, as we sat on the porch, she told me softly, "Sometimes the truth needs to burn a little before it warms." I wanted to believe her, but all I could feel was the sting of ash. On the third night after my confession, I heard something that changed the way I saw him. I had gone to bed early, but the faint murmur of his voice drifted down the hallway. I followed the sound and realized he was talking to himself in the Prosom guest room. His words came out between shallow breaths. "A failure of a man," he muttered. "A failure of a father." His tone wasn't angry this time. It was defeated, hollow. I stood there in the dark, listening, and for the first time, I saw how deep his regret ran. In that moment, my anger began to soften. Despite everything, the years of rejection, the silence, the bitterness, I couldn't hate him. He had built his life around a version of himself that no longer existed, and watching that crumble before him was punishment enough. I understood now that he wasn't just proud, he was lost. And I, for reasons I couldn't fully explain, still wanted to save him. The next morning, I found him in the kitchen, sitting at the table with his coffee. His face looked older than I remembered, his eyes tired but calm. Without thinking too much, I said, "You can stay here, Dad, as long as you need. The guest room, it's yours permanently." His gaze lifted to mine, surprise flickering for a brief second before he nodded silently. He didn't thank me, but he didn't refuse either. I took that as enough. I told Alyssa later that day, and she looked at me with quiet concern. "Are you sure, Clara?" she asked softly. "He's complicated." I smiled weakly. "So am I." She didn't argue. That was one of the things I loved most about her. She trusted me to make my own peace, even if it meant reopening old wounds. For a short while, things seemed calmer. My father kept to himself, spending his mornings outside in the garden or sitting in the workshop behind the house, repairing small wooden things just to pass the time. I would find him sanding old scraps or carving bits of cedar into small shapes. It reminded me of my childhood, the smell of sawdust in the air, the quiet rhythm of his work. For a fleeting moment, I thought maybe this was what healing looked like: slow, imperfect, but steady. But peace with my father was always temporary, fragile as thin glass. It didn't take long for the cracks to show again. I began to notice little things missing from the studio: small decorative items, antique handles, a polished wooden clock. At first, I thought I'd misplaced them. But when Alyssa asked about a customer inquiry for one of the pieces, I realized something was wrong. One afternoon, while I was organizing tools, I heard voices outside. My father's voice carried low but sharp, speaking to someone near the gate. I peeked through the window and saw him handing a man a wooden box, one of my finished restorations. The man handed him cash in return. My heart sank. I stepped outside, my voice shaking but firm. "What are you doing?" I asked. My father turned, startled. "Just selling a few things," he said quickly, as if it were harmless. "You have plenty of them." Plenty of them. The words hit me harder than I expected. Those pieces weren't just wood and polish, they were my work, my pride, my independence. Everything I had built without him. He didn't see that. To him, it was still his right to decide, to control, to take. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I simply turned away, because suddenly, everything was clear. My father hadn't learned anything. His pride had not softened into humility, it had merely shifted into survival. The realization hurt, but it also freed me. I could forgive the past, but I couldn't save a man determined to remain broken. That night, I sat alone in the studio long after Alyssa went to bed, surrounded by the smell of varnish and sawdust. I looked at my hands, steady, strong, marked by years of work, and thought about how much I had rebuilt. I realized then that redemption isn't always mutual. Sometimes you can offer it, but the other person has to be willing to take it. And my father wasn't. Not yet. Maybe not ever. When he tried to sell something from my workshop behind my back, I realized he hadn't learned anything at all. Forgiveness has limits, and mine ended the day my father betrayed my trust for the last time. I had spent weeks trying to rebuild something that no longer existed between us, convincing myself that kindness could heal the wounds pride had carved open. But the morning I discovered he'd sold one of my restored antiques to a neighbor, all that fragile hope shattered. It was a mahogany cabinet I'd spent nearly 3 weeks restoring, polishing every inch until the wood glowed under the light. It was special to me, not for its price, but because it had belonged to one of my earliest clients who trusted my craftsmanship. When Mrs. Langford, the neighbor, mentioned how grateful she was that Mr. Jensen had agreed to sell it to her for such a fair price, something inside me froze. At first, I thought I had misunderstood her. I smiled politely, pretending everything was fine, but as soon as she left, I went straight to the studio. The empty space where the cabinet had stood hit me like a blow. It wasn't just the loss of the object, it was the betrayal behind it. The knowledge that he had taken something I created, something that represented my independence, and traded it away as if it were his right. When I confronted him, he didn't even flinch. He sat in the living room, calmly sipping coffee, as though we were discussing the weather. "You sold it?" I demanded. He looked up, his eyes steady and unapologetic. "I needed the money," he said flatly. "After everything I've lost, I think I deserve some compensation." Those words hit me harder than any insult he'd ever thrown at me. Compensation. He called it as if my work, my years of effort, were some sort of debt he was owed. I felt something cold rise inside me then, a feeling I hadn't known since the night he told me I was no longer his daughter. It wasn't anger exactly. It was something quieter, more dangerous. The moment when you realize that love, no matter how deep, cannot coexist with disrespect. I took a step back, steadying my breath. "You can't stay here anymore," I said quietly. He looked startled for the first time, as though he hadn't expected me to finally draw a line. "You're throwing me out?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. I shook my head. "I'm asking you to take responsibility. You've been given grace and a second chance. But you can't keep taking from me as if the past never happened." That evening, I told Alyssa what had happened. She listened in silence, her expression soft but resolute. "You did everything you could," she said gently. "You tried to make peace with a man who refuses to find peace within himself. It's time to protect your peace, not your guilt." Her words settled over me like truth often does, uncomfortable but undeniable. I nodded, realizing she was right. The next morning, I told my father he could stay 1 more week, no longer. He didn't argue. He just looked at me with that unreadable expression, the same one he used when he was losing a fight but didn't want to admit it. "All right," he said finally, and then turned toward the hallway without another word. The sound of his footsteps faded down the corridor, and for the first time, I felt the weight of finality hanging in the air. That week felt longer than any I could remember. We moved around the house like 2 ghosts who no longer shared the same world. I went to work early, stayed late at the studio, anything to avoid the tension that filled the walls. Alyssa was careful with her words, trying to keep the peace, but even she couldn't hide the relief that crept into her eyes whenever she mentioned the approaching day he would leave. Still, there were moments that made me hesitate. One afternoon, I came home to find him sitting in the living room, staring at the family photos on the wall. He didn't notice me standing in the doorway. His shoulders slumped forward, his hands resting loosely in his lap. I wondered what he saw in those pictures, a lifetime of memories, or a record of everything he'd destroyed. I almost said something, almost offered comfort, but the words caught in my throat. We had been here before, the place where pity tangled with pain, and I knew it would only lead back to disappointment. As the week drew to a close, I began to pack his things. He didn't resist. He spent his evenings quietly, reading old newspapers or sitting outside as the sun went down. I wanted to believe he was reflecting, that somewhere inside him he was beginning to understand the consequences of his pride. But every time our eyes met, I saw only emptiness, the quiet surrender of a man who had spent too long running from himself. On his last morning, I woke early to find him already dressed, his duffel bag packed neatly by the door. The house was still, the kind of stillness that feels both peaceful and heavy. I made coffee, poured 2 cups, and handed one to him without a word. He accepted it, his hands trembling slightly. For a moment, we sat in silence, Two people bound by blood but separated by everything else. Finally, he spoke. "You were right to do what you did," he said quietly. His gaze fixed on the window. "You taught me how it feels to fall." I didn't know how to respond. There was no apology in his voice, only recognition, a weary acceptance that life had humbled him in ways I never could. I simply nodded. He stood, slung the duffel over his shoulder, and walked to the door. For a moment, I thought he might look back, say something that would make it all worth it. But he didn't. He just opened the door, stepped outside, and disappeared into the morning fog. As the sound of his truck faded down the road, I felt something strange settle over me, not triumph, not relief, but an aching calm. The house felt lighter, the air clearer, yet there was an emptiness I couldn't quite name. Alyssa came into the room a few minutes later, her eyes soft with concern. "Are you okay?" she asked. I smiled faintly. "I think so," I said. "I think I finally let him go." For days afterward, I caught myself expecting to hear his footsteps, to see his coat hanging by the door. But the silence that replaced them wasn't cruel anymore. It was healing. I went back to my work, back to my life, determined to move forward. That chapter, I thought, was finally over. But life, I've learned, has a way of circling back when you least expect it. 6 months later, on a gray December morning, I looked out the window to see a familiar truck pulling into the driveway. My breath caught in my chest. The same rusted pickup, the same slumped figure behind the wheel, only this time, he didn't look like a man seeking reconciliation. He looked like someone with nowhere left to go. But 6 months later, fate brought him back not as a man seeking shelter, but as someone with nowhere left to go. When I opened my door and saw my father standing there again, frail and homeless, I realized that time doesn't erase blood, it only tests it. The years had not been kind to him. His once strong frame was now thin and unsteady, his face drawn and pale beneath the dim porch light. The rusted pickup truck that had carried him away months ago was parked crookedly in the driveway, piled with blankets and cardboard boxes. For a long moment, we just stared at each other, me frozen in the doorway, him swaying slightly, his breath visible in the cold air. "I didn't know where else to go," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. The sight of him like that cracked something open inside me. All the anger I thought I'd buried melted into something softer, sadder. He was no longer the man who had disowned me, or the one who tried to control every corner of my life. He was simply a man undone by time, by pride, by regret. I couldn't turn him away. Not this time. Without a word, I stepped aside and opened the door wider. "Come in, Dad," I said quietly. Alyssa was in the kitchen when we came in. She looked up, startled at first, then her eyes softened with understanding. She didn't ask questions or remind me of the boundaries we'd set months earlier. She simply nodded and said, "Let's get him settled." That was Alyssa's way, silent grace in the moments when words would only make things harder. Together, we prepared the guest room again, though it felt different this time. There was no tension, no pretense of rebuilding old bonds. Only acceptance, the quiet kind that comes after a lifetime of fighting. My father barely spoke during those first few days. He moved through the house like a shadow, resting more than he walked, eating little, sleeping often. His health had clearly declined. The cold months had not been kind to a man living out of his truck. His hands, once steady and strong, now trembled as he tried to hold a Redigained cup of tea. I caught him wincing when he stood too quickly or coughed into his sleeve. The proud man I had known was fading, replaced by someone quieter, smaller, fragile in ways I had never imagined possible. For weeks, our home existed in silence again, but not the hostile kind we had endured before. This silence was gentle, cautious, as though we were both afraid to disturb the delicate truce forming between us. Over time, that silence began to shift. It started with small gestures, the way he nodded when Alyssa poured his coffee, the way he left tools neatly arranged on my workshop bench after using them. Then, one morning, he joined me in the studio without saying a word. He picked up a piece of sandpaper and began smoothing the edge of an old oak chair I'd been working on. We didn't speak for hours, but in that quiet rhythm of sanding and polishing, something unspoken began to mend. Days turned into weeks, and those wordless moments turned into small conversations. Began asking about my clients, about which types of wood held up best with age. I asked about his old shop, his favorite projects, And for the first time in decades, he told me stories from his youth not as lessons or lectures, but as memories. There was warmth in his voice when he spoke of my mother, a softness I had almost forgotten. Sometimes, he would pause in the middle of a story and stare at me for a long moment, as if realizing how much of life he'd missed by holding on to pride. Alyssa often watched us from a distance, her expression a mixture of tenderness and quiet relief. She told me one night as we were locking up the shop, "You two are finding your way back, one splinter at a time." I smiled faintly because she was right. It wasn't forgiveness all at once. It was a slow rebuilding, like repairing something fragile you were afraid might crumble again. As winter deepened, his health began to fail more noticeably. His cough worsened, his steps grew slower, and, some days he barely left his bed. Without even discussing it, I became his caretaker. I cooked his meals, made sure he took his medicine, and spent evenings sitting beside him as he dozed in his chair by the fire. Alyssa helped in quiet ways, bringing extra blankets, brewing herbal tea, making sure I didn't exhaust myself. The house, once divided by resentment, now felt unified by compassion. One evening, near the end of January, I found him in the workshop again. He was sitting at the bench, sanding the leg of a stool I'd been working on, though the movement of his hands was slow and weak. I stood beside him, handing him a clean cloth. He took it, wiped the dust from the wood, and said softly, "You saved more than my house, Clara. You saved me." The words caught me off guard. I looked at him, and for the first time, there was no pride left in his eyes, only peace. He smiled faintly, his lips trembling. "You did what I couldn't," he added. "You learned to love, without needing to win." I wanted to tell him that I hadn't done it alone, that Alyssa's love had shown me what forgiveness could look like, that his redemption had come not from me, but from the simple act of letting go. But before I could speak, he reached out and took my hand. His grip was frail but steady. "I'm proud of you," he whispered. They were words I had waited a lifetime to hear. I squeezed his hand and nodded, tears burning behind my eyes. He passed peacefully a week later. It was early morning when Alyssa found me sitting by his bed, holding his hand as the last bit of warmth faded from his fingers. The house was still, the fire burned low, and outside, the first snowfall of February was settling over the yard. There was no pain, no chaos, just quiet release. For the first time, I felt that he had finally found rest, both in body and in spirit. We buried him in the garden behind the house, the one he used to complain was too wild. I planted lavender and rosemary near his resting place, herbs my mother used to love. The birds returned that spring, building nests in the trees that overlooked the garden. And every morning, as sunlight filtered through the leaves, I felt a strange kind of comfort knowing he was part of the place he once tried to control. The house didn't feel haunted by him, it felt whole again, filled with the echoes of both pain and peace. Today, years later, I still live in that same house with Alyssa. The walls hold every chapter of our story, the arguments, the silence, the forgiveness. Sometimes, when I walk through the workshop and catch the faint scent of sawdust and cedar, I can almost feel him beside me, sanding wood in that quiet, steady rhythm we once shared. I don't speak to his memory, I simply smile, knowing that somehow, we both found redemption in the same place we were once broken. As I stand on the porch in the evenings, watching the sun sink behind the birch trees, I realize something I never could have understood when I was younger. Saving his house wasn't about property or debt, it was about grace. It was about choosing compassion when resentment would have been easier. In saving his house, I saved the part of myself that still believed in love's ability to heal. The home that once echoed with rejection now hums softly with peace, a place where ghosts don't linger, they rest. As I watch the sun set over the home that holds both ghosts and grace, I realize that saving his house saved my soul too. In the end, I learned that forgiveness doesn't always come with reconciliation sometimes. It's just the peace of knowing you chose compassion over bitterness. My father's house still stands, not as a symbol of what he lost, but of what I found: strength, grace, and freedom. I saved his home once, but in doing so, I saved the part of myself that still believed in love's power to heal. Now, when I walk through those quiet rooms, I don't hear regret anymore, only peace. And that, I think, is what redemption truly sounds like. If this story touched something deep in you, Don't leave in silence, share it so someone else might find their own peace too. And if you believe forgiveness is stronger than pride, tap the like button and stay with me for more stories that remind us what the heart never forgets. But tell me this, if someone once erased you from their life, would you still open your door if they came back?